Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your patience in getting started. I like to leave a little bit of time for people to filter in, but about 5 minutes. If you're 5 minutes late, you're going to miss the start of the party. So we're going to get this going. My name is Paul Lippitz. I work with McKenna. I'm down here with my team, and we are conducting this week a charrette to work on an update to the Zionsville Town Code. Very simply, I would describe the town code or the current zoning code in Zionsville as kind of being an amalgamation of three townships that came together. One of our primary tasks is sorting through the redundancy and trying to make sure that we preserve land uses, valuable spaces in the town, but make sure that it's regulated in a way that is logical, makes sense, and is respectful of residents and their wishes for how the town develops in the future. So a big part of that is learning and listening. So tonight is a listening session. We're going to give you about a 45-minute, possibly a little bit longer than 45-minute presentation to kind of introduce you to some of the analysis that we've done. And then we'd really like to hear from everybody. Quickly, just an orientation of some of the things that we'll do during our discussion tonight. We do have maps. These are the existing future land use and zoning maps. We've got this focused on the Union portion of the town. In the back, though, we have this map here. We call this the kitchen table. So it's nice to kind of stand around and see the whole town. I know if you have your family or friends over your house, you might stand around the kitchen and talk about what's on your mind, what's happening. This is kind of our version of that. So we want to learn about the community from you, talk, and we'll put Post-its on the map, learn a little bit about what the issues are that you'd like represented in the ordinance as we work with it tonight. And then in general, this over here is our big idea board. Doesn't have to be a big idea. It can be a big issue that you want to address. Whatever came here tonight, you probably came here with some things that you wanted to let us know about. This is an opportunity for us to capture that. So what we're doing is we're capturing as much of the issues and impressions about the town as we can as we go through this process. We also have a fun thing that we'd like to do tonight, and that's also over on this table that has some of the planning documents for the town, and it's we call it a mental mapping exercise. But what that means is it's kind of like your personal impression of what's important about the town. So landmarks that you enjoy, how you understand the place. And it doesn't have to be, we're basically asking you to draw a map. Where your house is, where downtown is, the places that you go. Because really, your impression, your perception of the community is formed by being a person, by walking around. And those are the things that we want you to put on the map, or the things that are important to you. Because it will help us understand what your perceptions are. We'll give you another orientation about that, but that's kind of what you see around the room. And then we'd like to kind of get started here with some introductions. My name is Paul Lippitz. I'm a vice president with McKenna. We're a planning and zoning firm. We do urban design, some architecture, some community planning all around the Midwest. And it's our pleasure to be here working with you in Zionsville. I myself lived for 3 years or so in Broadrickville, and I did some planning in the area during that time. And it's been a pleasure for me to be back in this community, spending some time to work with everybody. Let my team introduce themselves. And Adam, why don't you go first? And I'd like you to kind of give a background on what a charrette is. Can you do that? All right.
Thank you, Paul. And good evening, everybody. My name is Adam Cook. I'm a planning consultant with McKenna. And we have thrown that word out there, charrette. Is that a familiar word to anybody? Raise a hand if you've heard that word. Okay, getting a couple hands raised. We're starting to see that more and more. But I'll explain it to everybody that isn't familiar with the little story. It is a French word, and it means little cart. Basically, it means something like that. Okay, so if you were in Paris, you would call that a charrette. But more or less, if you were in Paris about 100 years ago, that word's not really used in modern times, but it was used back when the Beaux-Arts Academy, the students were doing architecture projects, design projects, and so on and so forth. And when it came time to turn them in for those projects to go into basically the jury room where their professors would grade them, a docent, an assistant would come around with a little push cart such as that one, collect the drawings. And there's actually a print or a sketch of these students walking alongside this cart with their pens, making last-minute adjustments to their drawings and designs before they were going to be graded. That kind of frenetic, highly creative environment, that's where we get that word from. Because in a charrette, it's where we come into the community and we work basically 24/7 all week long. We're embedded in the community. And we want to do that so that we can be constantly talking to you, residents from all areas, geographic areas of the town, stakeholders, our partners with the town government, elected officials, appointed officials. Get the ear of as many of you as possible to have a thorough understanding of the project, because this is about the future of the community. We're going to talk a lot about the impacts and ramifications of that tonight. But that's where the word charrette comes from. In modern day, it's where we sort of embed ourselves in the community and have a frenetic, highly creative, compressed work program, and hopefully are able to come out with some very rough draft ingredients to show you by the end of the week that will then take forward and refine some more, so that work product is reflective of your input and the values and issues that come up. So, Paul, I think that's
good introduction. Chris, and then Mike.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Corey, planner with McKenna. One thing I bring to the team is experience in a lot of rural areas. So obviously we're a rural part of the community tonight. We'll be very interested to talk to you guys about agricultural preservation. And I know there's an elephant in the room with regard to solar panels. We'll have that conversation too.
I'm Michael Campbell. I'm the architect on the team. My role this week will be doing, first of all, building types for the form-based code. This involves a little bit of architecture and construction, placement of buildings on site, how buildings will be placed on individual sites. And the other thing I'm doing is helping you all develop a consensus vision for the rural areas out in the townships, like what we have here.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. And then I just want to point out we have our partners from the town here in the back. We've got Suzanne and Wayne, and I think it's Christina, right?
Close enough.
Did she say close enough? Oh, help me out. Chrissy. Okay. Chrissy in the back. Thank you, Chrissy. And so, and we have all of you, and we'll have some time to meet you this evening as well. So I mentioned briefly that part of what our objective here is to kind of do some reorganizing and consolidating, right? What I mean when I say that is, we understand that a lot of what exists in this area is precious, that people like the town. People move to the town for a reason, or they live here. Maybe you were born here, and that change can be difficult. And one of the things that I think about is planning and zoning, right? Is if you like the place that you live, the worst thing that you can do is nothing, because change is coming, development is there, but you can protect and preserve what is valuable, and you can make sure that new developments happen according to the wants, desires, perceptions, and needs of the community. And that's what we're here to learn about tonight. What are the wants, the needs, the desires of the community, so that we can make sure that any new development is done in a way that is respectful and at least incorporates the hopes and the dreams of the people that live here. So when we say we're here to listen, we mean that very intently. When Adam talks about the charrette process and why we like to embed in the community, is because it gives us time to nurture these conversations, to have them, and to learn, and then to synthesize to candidate recommendations. So our hope is to develop those candidate recommendations. So whether we sometimes use the term conventional zoning to describe what really is just a zoning code, right? The zoning code regulates the types of things that can be developed in places. And zoning really dates back in the United States in the 1920s. Many communities were planned and zoned really not until the 50s. Adam's going to talk a little bit about the history of planning and zoning in this region a little bit later. But in creating form-based codes, what we're looking to do is to, for lack of better words, illustrate those design concepts so that they become more accessible and then they're more likely to be implemented according to what the code actually is requiring. So foster predictable building, resulting in a high-quality public realm and regulating physical form. I like to show this picture when we talk about physical form, especially when we talk about urbanism and urbanism within a rural context. This is the Dixboro General Store. I grew up in Michigan. This is right outside of Ann Arbor in a small urbanizing community. But what it has managed to do is retain its rural character. And general stores, mixed-use places in rural areas, they tend to have these qualities. Qualities that are somewhat similar to the types of qualities you see in cities or urban places. And this is another place that I live here. This is actually First Avenue in New York City. And if you look at the things that are common, what makes this a successful place to go from a general store perspective is they are on a zero lot line. They allow mixes of uses. They have traffic signals. They're organized in places that are accessible by multiple modes. They have multiple stories, so they allow use in these places on first, second, sometimes third stories, but in a way that's respectful of the context. So if you look at the Dixboro General Store, it's a house, right? It's a house that was built, but it is 2 stories. Whereas in a more urban environment, you have a context or scale that is more fitting of that level of development. The transparency of ground floors, punch awnings, window design, these types of design standards form what we call precedents. And those are the types of things that you can regulate better with a form-based code than with a traditional code, because you can show pictures and you can base the types of design you like around precedents. So one of the things you might help us figure out tonight are what are your favorite buildings in this area that you think would be good if other buildings mimic or were designed on? Because we can actually code those through zoning. We can make sure that new development matches those places. And it's also possible to make what we might call traditional suburban areas develop in this one as well. And I think there's a lot of good examples in this region of good quality, conventional style suburban audio-oriented development. And I don't want anyone here to think that we don't think that's good as well, right? We understand that there are places that should be designed to fit all types of development and needs, and that's what we want to figure out is where those places are in this town. I mentioned that in working through design standards and in identifying precedents, we look to create easy to understand standards that can be used by developers to create their design plans for buildings. These are just some examples here of the types of things that you can use to retrofit different types of developments at various scales. So as I mentioned, it starts by identifying precedents. So we want to understand what the good places are, what the places you want replicated in this community are, and then you can use that understanding to develop standards. We have a saying we use sometimes, you get what you zone for, right? So by putting it in the zoning code, you control what types of developments can happen. And that's when the precedents become standards. The standards will be requirements. Another thing that we look to do as we go through this process is understand the difference between creating districts, but creating places or neighborhoods and what's needed in neighborhoods, and then linking them to the transportation system through corridor development. And I think that's one of the things we can talk tonight on our big kitchen table map is where some of those smaller places would be. Sometimes we call them hamlets, really just a corner store on a corner. And there is, Adam's going to talk a little bit about some of the historic hamlets in this region as well. As we kind of work through that and we map these areas, there's ways to develop regulating plans. And in form-based codes, you can kind of do two different approaches. The approach here on the right, this is a regulating plan that through those precedents and standards I mentioned, will code different types of densities into smaller districts. And that's called a regulating plan. It's part of the zoning map. This is an example of a concept plan, which then actually illustrates where the buildings and roads might go in a development like that. And both of these are possible through form-based coding, and you don't see them as much in a conventional zoning map like the ones you see over here. I think the other thing that's valuable of this concept for districts, neighborhoods, and corridors is understanding that places change, right? And not every place is the same. In the town of Zionsville, we have different types of contexts. We've got neighborhood context. We've got some neighborhood residential, kind of strictly residential. And then we have the natural and urban, rural context too. And somewhere, what we want to do is understand where we need to protect and which areas fall on which part of this spectrum, from more developed to more preserved spaces. And this is a process of managing growth and controlling growth to go into places where the town desired. So again, in summary here, form-based codes are kind of an alternative to conventional zoning. There are also hybrid codes, which will maintain some elements of a conventional zoning code, but also incorporate some form-based code elements. But ultimately, they all lead to the same thing, which is fostering predictable building results, so that we can get high-quality development and development that matches the community's desires or preferences. So form-based codes can be used to reverse trends that are also undesirable, right? So if there has been development in areas which people don't like to see, we can utilize form-based codes to also require retrofitting or building out those spaces in a way that match the community preferences and ultimately let people live closer to where they want to work and shop. There's also a slight difference in the way these are usually represented. The conventional zoning codes are kind of a yellow and orange and red. And then when we get into the form-based codes, we usually use this lilac and purple color palette, which shows rather an intensity of development from lower to higher intensity. So the darker color purples are really the center of the town. I would actually say probably in this context, the only place we use the darker purple is in downtown Zionsville, and everything else would be a lighter shade. Here. Another thing about conventional zoning is it's really designed just about setbacks. For dimensional regulations, we've got setbacks, we've got building dimensions, lot coverage. Those types of regulations are still existing in a conventional code or in a form-based code, but what we want to do is make it easier to access. So we'll create tables so that you can go right to a district and then understand what the dimensional standards are, rather than having to read through 200 pages to try to figure out whether or not you can put an accessory structure on your lot. So again, aspects of form-based codes, regulating plans. We're looking to define a district's character. We're more interested in the character of development than the uses that are there. We want them to be attractive, built from quality materials, have good windows, have the parking located in a place and have an appropriate amount of parking. These types of design features are what we're really looking to understand in a form-based code. And then the other thing that is interesting about what form-based codes do is that they can regulate buildings by story as well. So where in a conventional zoning code, you might just say, oh, you can have residential and commercial on this site. You would call that a mixed-use site. In a form-based code, we can be more specific about requiring a retail element on the first floor and permitting some other types of uses on second and third. Another thing that form-based codes do is rather than having setbacks, like you must build your house or your retail use at least 10 foot back from the lot line. A form-based code actually might say you're required to build your house or your retail structure 10 foot from the lot line. Because what you want to do is control the frontage and make sure that that frontage is designed in a way that creates the quality of place that the code intends. And then, of course, I've talked a lot about architectural regulations, but many conventional zoning codes are very shy on architectural regulations, and it's an important part about design. I think the other things that we can have codes about street types and connections. So requiring a pedestrian connection between lots, requiring bike parking, requiring bike connections. These things can be regulated by form-based codes. Form-based codes can also streamline development processes. So if we can get consensus on the type of development that's required, we can also streamline the development process so that people that comply with the town's visions and requirements can get it done quicker. And as I mentioned, form-based codes can permit development concepts that say, you must build this concept. And if you do, you would be eligible for that fast track process. If you don't want to build that process, that type of project, you won't be fast tracked, right? Because the community has consensus around this vision. So this is the other thing I think is important to understand about where we are at in this process. Our team did a fair amount of analysis before we came here for this week to meet with everybody, but we are very much in the beginning of the process. So before yesterday, we had no recommendations that we were ready to make. We heard a little bit yesterday and today. We're starting to form some recommendations, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we heard tonight, and then we want to hear more from you. So each day, we're going to create a feedback loop. We're going to hear a little more, and then we're going to report back on what we've heard so that we build a progress and we try to build that consensus throughout this week. So the things that you say tonight, we will be presenting on tomorrow, and then on Thursday, we'll do a summary presentation of all the events, and we'll talk about what we heard tonight and work on throughout the week. So again, once we get to this draft code, we still need technical feedback before we issue a draft. Then we'll issue a draft. After that, public hearings. So there is more feedback even after the draft is made. So at this point, we have no draft. We're still working on research so that we can draft a code that is representative of what this community wants and needs. All right, so that's my introduction. And now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Adam, who's going to do a food for thought presentation. And I think he's got some interesting stuff about the history of development in Zionsville to share with you.
Great, thank you, Paul. Okay, I just want to do a really quick survey, a quick show of hands, if I might. How many people here live in Union? Looking like the great majority, but anybody from Eagle not part of the village? Okay, a couple. Anybody from right in the historic village? Not seeing anybody. And last but not least, anybody from Perry? Okay, well, wonderful. That helps me calibrate what I'm going to talk about a little bit and some of the slides that I'm going to show you. This is kind of they're giving me the fun part of the presentation. All right, this is a little bit philosophical and hopefully gets you a little excited and even motivated. Because let's face it, I know you hear the word zoning and everybody's eyes may start to glaze over. So we want to make this kind of interesting and fun process for everybody to talk about. And so I'd like to do a little history lesson. And I'm sure I am just restating things that many of you know, many of you have heard, and most likely many of your ancestors, your parents, your grandparents, and on up have actually been involved in through the generations, leaving you this beautiful place that you're the caretakers of today. And when I kind of wrap up, we'll get into what's coming for tomorrow. But let's go back. Let's go back to, in this case, 1878. This is a great map that came out of the Boone County Atlas from 1878. And it may be a little bit difficult to see the way the spring is set up. But what you see is this isn't the entire county. So this is just the area that's generally the town of Zionsville as we know it today. And we can see Union Township and Eagle Township and Perry Township and also Worth Township, which for the most part is now the city of Whitestown. But this is the area that we occupy, that we inhabit today. And you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner of that map, you'll see what looks like the center. That's Zionsville. That's the historic village in basically the same form that it still exists in today. You can see the rail line, which is now the rail trail going off to the northwest from Zionsville. But I encourage you to look more to the upper right-hand corner of that map. Look at Union Township. And notice all of the little settlements that dotted Union Township back in 1878. We've got one in Northfield, which is just over on 421. Just north of here, and west of here a little bit, we've got Boston. There's even one that maybe is a little bit newer that's on that rail line, which is that dotted line you can see right across the top of the map. It's, I'm having a, Gadsden, thank you. Gadsden is not shown on there. Although there is another one over further out of the country called Rasper. So you can see that the original settlement pattern here 100 years ago was dotted with all of these very, very small, we call them hamlets. Maybe they supported one store, maybe they supported a church, but it was really a small community that was based around an advantageous location, such as a drop-off point on a rail line for grain or for crops or something of that nature. Or considering that this was before the automobile, it was a relatively convenient stopping point for someone traveling at the speed of maybe a horse and buggy, or otherwise, like I said, someone traveling personally, on the railroad. I'm going to go through this one kind of quickly because these are, when I say town land use regulations, I'm talking about what was the original village of Zionsville. And so that doesn't necessarily apply to what was going on up here in Union Township, but it is instructive to know that we have been regulating land use for a long time in the United States. Zoning is a more modern technique of doing that. Zoning really became popular right around 100 years ago. And it started in some of our larger cities like San Francisco and New York. And then by the 1920s, the practice was upheld in a Supreme Court case called Euclid versus Amber. And I won't go into that, although that's very interesting. Once it was upheld by the Supreme Court as a legal use of local, what they call police powers, standard zoning enabling acts were promulgated. And by the 1940s, 50s, 60s, had been adopted in most local jurisdictions. And in Indiana, it was typically more into the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s that the more rural townships and counties that served those townships adopted rural zoning ordinances. But you can see that for the town of Zionsville, their first land use ordinance was all the way back in 1881. They abolished the slaughtering of animals on any property. And it's a very interesting read word for word, because there are a lot of terms for things that we don't use today. And you can also see that going back to 1923, before the town or the village had zoning, they had to issue a permit for something brand new that they'd never done before, something called an oil filling station. So these types of issues, as technology changed, towns were growing to adapt to new technologies. These issues were handled on a kind of case-by-case basis. In Zionsville's case, the village adopted a first passive zoning ordinance all the way back in November of 1941, just before the onset of World War II. If we go back, we can look at things like how did Zionsville develop. This is something I'll go into more when we have more of a village-based audience, probably tomorrow night. You can see what we did there in the original class. So I'm standing in front of but you can see how Zionsville, all these different colors in the village for different class that were done individually by individual developers and speculators. What you can see is that we really followed the same pattern. The original plat for the village was that yellow point that in the lower right corner along the railroad tracks. And then I believe the green portion followed, and then it spread out from there. But you notice that even though the block block sizes were a little bit different. There's still roughly the same structure in each of those editions. Everybody that created one of those editions, the original town plat, kind of followed the general pattern. Even though they weren't 100% the same, they followed the pattern of what came before. And instead of having detailed codes in those days, people generally followed the overall pattern. They looked at the context of the area, of the types of buildings, and those were determined by the types of architects and builders that lived in the area and their knowledge that was passed down to generations. And things kind of developed to a certain contextual similarity and around general community consensus. That sort of pattern language together developed. In Zionsville's case, two flats didn't line up correctly. And so the streets didn't line up. That's why Zionsville's Main Street has that jog in it. Believe it or not, that's people surveying it. In the 1870s, the town purchased a plot of land right on that corner to make that nice, smooth jog in the street. And of course, that's the postcard view. That's what people think of when they think of kind of Zionsville, right? That creates that postcard image. And that was all by accident. That was as Bob Ross, if you've ever watched that show, or even there's a documentary about him come out recently. But if you're familiar with Bob Ross, I'd like to say happy accidents. And things like that are happy accidents when it comes to placemaking. I am going to go through very quickly some of these slides because they talk very specifically about what's going on in the village. But the area that's now part of Union and Cleveland Township still was influenced by the development of that. And one of the ways it's influenced was by the transportation networks that grew around Zionsville and then started connecting regional places. This was a region that really was on the cutting edge, of all forms of transportation. Going all the way back to the original steam railroads, locomotives, moving up to the interurban streetcar. What you see there is just a little map of central Indiana for one of the regional streetcar maps. These were all places you could get to without taking a walk. I mean, you may have to change streetcars at 50, but from Zionsville, you could go all the way up to Lafayette on a streetcar. You could go into Indianapolis and you could change. You could out to Muncie, go down to Green Street, go down to Martin Street, all on interurban streetcars. In the 1910s, 1920s, I mean, this was a really effective form of regional mass transportation. And as a matter of fact, my great-grandfather was an urban operator in the Columbus, Ohio area. He drove a car on the line that connected Columbus, Ohio, north to Delaware. If you're familiar with Central Ohio. And then, of course, the automobile era. The automobile era was really the era that impacted greatly the development patterns because now people could move when they wanted, where they wanted, at a much faster speed than having to wait on somebody else's timetable, say for a train, and on somebody else's rate of speed, which is typically a lot slower. And so with the automobile era, of course, we get the interstate highway system, we get Interstate 65 and 465, Interstate 74, and now a whole other dimension to how people navigate our region, how industry locates in our region. Industry now doesn't have to be necessarily in the center of a town or of a large city. Industry can now start to propagate along those interstate highway corridors. And the types of development that spawned were more auto-oriented forms. Now, this is Boone Village. This is close in to the historic village, but it's still very similar to it's from the 1970s. But if you were to just go into Westfield, just a few miles behind where we're sitting, you would see the newest instantiation of it. It's the exact same thing, just much bigger and much flashier and much bolder, but it's the exact same concept. Typically, you have a lot of parking, and in most cases, more parking than there's an economic need for. That parking is a cost, some cost subsidized by the developer. It's very dependent on automobiles. Yes, you can physically walk to these places, but you wouldn't do it unless you had no other choice. This is one of the series of slides I like to do just for illustrative purposes. I want to show you 4 aerial photographs and just give you a general idea of what we're looking at. And it's always a little hard in these venues where we have this is an aerial photograph of the county back in 1955. And the next 3 photographs after this, they're all the same extent. So when you look at the lower right-hand corner of that, you'll see the original photo of Zionsville, along the right edge, that road is kind of a diagonal line leading up, and that is 421 Michigan Road. 421. So just for clarity purposes, we wanted to get more, and this is a good extent, and is representative of the changes that Boone County, Zionsville, and these townships have seen over the last 70 or so years. So let's move up. Let's move up to 1981. And if I go back and forth a couple of times, from 55 to 81, okay, that's about a 25-year span. And what you can see is a fairly radical change in land use patterns over those 25 years. Again, that's the influence of the automobile era. And the sort of single-use types of zoning that Paul talked about as we exhibit to that. Right? We can see a lot of single-use residential subdivisions. This is more prominent, but we're very familiar with the pattern. Typically, streets that aren't connected, cul-de-sacs, things of that nature. The other thing I want to have you look at is the rural fabric. We look at the rural fabric in 1955. This is generally all academic. There are very few lots. And these are high-res aerial photos. So on a computer, I can show you that we zoom in and we can actually get a really good look at these parcels. And what we can see is that there haven't been a lot of lots that are split off. These are typically property owners who are farming the large majority of their land. There are just a few exceptions to that in the 1950s. But again, by 1981, even in the more rural areas, you can see that change. You can see, even if it's not conventional residential development, you're seeing individual splits off of larger properties for what we would call rural residential or more agricultural style residential. I'm going to move up another 15 years. That's 2005. So 81 and 2005. And really what we're seeing is that first pattern I showed you just accelerated. So again, you can see those original subdivisions now are really ingrained in the local fabric and more than that. We've had more lots of this. Again, nothing really that different. The pattern that kind of got started in the Midwest in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s continued to pace all the way up through 2008. And then it kind of got a slow start again in the last decade. And so that takes us to recent times, 2020. And so even in the last 50 years, you can see that this is a region that is facing a lot of growth pressures. There's a lot of demand to live in this area. It's a great place to live. But between Union Township, Eagle Township, and all of these neighboring jurisdictions that are also facing their own growth pressures, this is the context that we need to think about zoning sort of in that context. And we as a team need to think about zoning in that context as, where is Union Township in different growth trajectories that we're seeing? In Central Indiana. So there's pressure from Brownsville coming in from the south in Murray County. There's pressure from Marble, there's pressure from Westview coming in the west. And then, of course, Whitestown is doing its own thing. It's kind of in the middle of this interestingly shaped jurisdiction we have called the town Zionsville, right? That's what we call, or we're calling on our team, reorganization here. So kind of the current era, 2000 to present, when the annexations and then finally reorganization came to be. And I just had, that's over in Perry, but there are a number of places very similar to that here in Union Township as well. I didn't mention again, it's one that's still relatively developed and clustered in. And like I said, it's where we considered last night. But again, these are the places that were kind of historic centers. They absorbed the demand for growth in these rural places, and yet kept the area overall in a more rural context. And Mike's going to be talking about rural as well. So when we talk about zoning, and on this crazy zoning map here, you'll see that there is a thick line. I believe it's a red line that goes right through Eagle Township. Yeah, Chris is pointing at it. And that's what we call the rural-urban boundary. So as Paul mentioned, the zoning ordinance is an amalgamation of several zoning ordinances that were all kind of put under one cup back when the town reorganized. And in so doing, there are urban, quote-unquote, urban zoning districts, and there are, quote-unquote, rural zoning districts. And there are a ton of zoning districts. If you look at that budget, there are, county ordinance 40 plus zoning districts, and they are not unique. Many of them duplicate each other Some of them contradict each other, and one of the things we need to do is, at the very least, eliminate those contradictions and duplications. But one question to take away from this evening is, what does that rural-urban boundary mean? Is it just a line on a map? Going forward, we want to make sure that we rationalize a lot of what's in the zoning ordinance. But is that rural-urban line, even if it's a philosophical line, or it's a policy-based line, as a line in the sand, what meaning does that have to residents, both within the village and in the more rural, less developed areas of the town? And so again, I went ahead of myself. Those are some pictures of us, as you know, of just outside here with Whitestown and Westfield. You can see the types of road pressures. So to wrap up, the coming era. What is the coming era? What's the next 20 or 25 years spell? Decisions that we make, just as what we've inherited, this beautiful place was handed down to us by the generations that came before. And now it's our turn. It's our turn to set the stage so that it's still a beautiful place, a wonderful place, a high quality place to live for the generations that succeed us, our children, our grandchildren. And so as one of many tools to do that, what we're embarking on is really an important project. It's not just in one ear out the other. Work on kind of a walking policy document and then, put it on the table or on the, I guess it's now on the digital bookshelf and let it gather a digital desk and forget about it. This is a document, this is a policy tool and a legislative tool that's really going to make a significant impact in what happens and what does not happen in the years to come in the town, which is why we're excited to be doing it. We're excited to be working with you. We're excited to hear from you what your input is and what the vision is as we all move forward. And so I appreciate your time. I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk a little bit more about that rural character aspect.
Thanks, Adam. As I stated earlier, one of my roles is to help you arrive at a consensus vision for the rural areas. You probably all know what those are. Perry, Eagle, and Union Township. So, Perry Township over here, Union up here, and Eagle, the area that runs between Whitestown and the village. Now, the way these are developed conventionally looks like this. And you can see it on the white lines on the kitchen table map. You can see that spreading. You can see it on the maps that Adam presented. It's basically if a piece of farmland is going to be developed, it's first going to be developed as residential, and that being the case, it's going to be developed with all large lot single-family homes, and they'll fill up the site entirely. And then they'll be followed by this, which is because services traditionally follow residential development. And then the area is no longer rural. So people move out here because it's rural and they love it, but then it just becomes not rural anymore. What we'd like to propose instead is a vision for hamlets set within the existing rural landscape. Okay? And oh gosh, actually wireless. Let's see. And the hamlet will look more like this. I have a sketch for you. This is Van Buren Township, Michigan. We did this recently, so I was able to include it in our presentation. And what we've done here, in the previous slide, you had 40-acre lot and 40 lots, and here we have a 40-acre plot and 40 lots. But here the lots are clustered around an intersection, and they assigned a maximum lot size of 66 by 132, which is exactly 0.2 acres. So instead of having 1 acre lots and getting 40 of them on 40 acres, you have 0.2 acre lots and you get 40 of them on 40 acres. But now you have vast areas of preserved agricultural landscapes. You get more of a rural character. Excuse me?
I'm talking to myself now.
Okay.
What's gonna happen to the rural? Who's talking all that? What's going to that?
The rural.
They already around the house.
Oh, continue to be farmed, or it could be recreational.
You can actually write that in the zoning code. So once this is built, you can't build any more houses. You have to stay farming. You can now use the development rights to the property to build those 40 houses, and you don't get any more.
No, no, they come along and take it out.
No, it would be literally illegal to build another house.
In the deed
In the
restriction.
D, it would be deep, yeah. This is the idea we're proposing.
Yeah, and that's what I neglected to mention is that the 1 unit per acre is the development rights associated with that parcel. And this is Van Buren Township, Michigan. And, so once you've built 40,
You build 40 houses, you're done.
you're done. Just that we're going to try to write, we'd like to try to write code, propose write code that concentrates.
Just briefly, we are going to do questions at the end, so I would like, if it's okay with everybody, for you to let Mike finish, and let's go through the presentation, and then we'll open it up to everyone. We'll take some questions.
And some of the questions might be answered in subsequent slides.
It's true.
So I'll let you farther. In this area, actually all 3 townships that I mentioned, Union, Eagle, and Perry, you actually have 1 unit. The development rights associated with the agricultural parcels are one unit per 2 acres. So you would preserve even more because you only get 20. But a developer here is only going to get 20. So you have even more landscape preserved in what is Zionsville, we're calling it now. So that's the hamlet concept. All right, so that's just basically treating the development rights and development pressure on agricultural parcels. But the other thing we'd like to propose is new walkable mixed-use developments or actual towns set within the same rural landscape. And they can accommodate more development in these little hamlets we're talking about. They can have more retail and more multifamily housing, which we call missing middle. A good example of towns set in a rural landscape is west of Stuttgart, Germany. I drew actually on the map of Germany here, I drew a black box, which is the size of one township in the United States, 36 square miles, 6 miles by 6 miles. You can see over there the development pattern. They can develop, in this case, 9 complete cities or suburban towns in that landscape and still have mostly open space. And you probably experienced looking at places suburban to Indianapolis that doesn't happen in the United States. Generally, the whole area gets built out, except for maybe a few large recreational fields and things like that. And then also they have these hamlets. There's a smattering, in addition to the 9 towns, there's a smattering of hamlets all over. But they still have all that open space. It's a combination. You can see it in the picture on the left. In this case, it's agricultural, but it's a combination of agricultural and forest land. It's kind of hilly around Stuttgart, so we've got some wooded hillsides as well. And so we call this rural character because rural areas are made up of small towns set in a serene rural landscape with numerous hamlets. And we'd like to show this picture of Crested View, Colorado, because you can see the town and the rural landscape in the same image. And we can appreciate it. And also because the 2 buildings in the middle here, the more colorful ones, they were actually constructed in early aughts. Is that what you call it? The early 2000s, the early aughts. Actually 2000 and 2002, respectively. And they were designed and constructed according to a code that was written in the late 1970s, or a form-based code. So, in order to achieve this pattern of development, we need to first identify locations for town development, and then reserve the remaining areas for the hamlets in the front. So we've taken a stab at this. We're learning more. We've been here a couple of days now. We're learning more. So initially, we took a stab at it. We located four locations. Not as many as you see around Stuttgart, but still, they could be pretty extensive. And they're designed to sort of capture that development, much of that development, and, provide the opportunity for people to live in an area where they don't have to drive everywhere. They can walk. Maybe someday there's some kind of transit implemented to connect them. They might not even have to own a car. Of course, these days you can order everything from Amazon, you can grocery store, take Ubers, you don't have to have a car anyway, right? And once the locations have been, once we settle on the locations, we can zone them. But then we want to code them so that the development resembles what you would like to see. And, stakeholders like you are called upon to identify precedents upon which new developments are to be based. So, most of the time in communities where we've worked, they identify their downtown, which in your case would be Zionsville Village. In some cases where they don't have a downtown, I'd say Union Township qualifies for that. They identify a nearby small town we would like. We could like for example Nashville, Indiana. Like you might say, we like Nashville. We would like these towns to look like Nashville, Indiana. But whatever the case may be, once that's settled, our design team goes out. We measure the streets. We measure the streets. We measure the sidewalks, the building setbacks, the building heights, the areas of the windows on the ground floor, the areas of windows on the upper floor, locations of light fixtures, and spacing of light fixtures, trees. And we code all of that so when the towns are built, they come out like that. Well, one thing that got lost this time I think in all of our presentations so far is that when we develop these town centers, they have a retail component. The town centers need to be located on highways or rail lines. Locating them on a rail line wouldn't do much good in this era. They need to be located on highways so that there's they have visibility with the retail at the edge of the development, so it has visibility from the highway and there's traffic going by. Because those retail components of these mixed-use developments can't survive on the residents of that town alone. They have to have another 30,000 people every day going by in order to make the retail viable. That's it. All right.
Thanks, Mike. Before we start discussion, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've been doing since we've been here, and a little bit about what we've learned and what we sort of developed at this point. The big takeaway we've heard so far is we want to enhance the existing reality of this community. Right? This is people like living here. This is a desirable community. That's why there's road pressure. That's why there's going to be growth. That's why we have to manage that growth. We need to understand the market, which is what I just described. There's growth pressure, we need to manage it. Now, one thing that I think is sort of an impediment to making sure that what gets built is what we want is the complexity of the current zoning ordinance. As we mentioned a couple times, it is literally 2, maybe 3 zoning ordinances put together without ever anyone going through and checking if they match each other. And I know that many of you are familiar with the urban-rural concept within the town, and that means things in addition to zoning, right? It means things in terms of services provided, tax rates, etc. We are not proposing to change any of that. But we are proposing to change that from a zoning perspective, because there really isn't a big difference between a house in the urban area and a house in the rural area, except that this is a rural area, as has been discussed in terms of its physical development pattern, and that is a suburban or urban area. We can accommodate that zoning, we don't have to do everything twice. So, what have we been doing? We've taken a look at some of the districts that are in the current ordinance. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of them. All right, and see, okay, can we consolidate these down? So these are the zoning districts we currently have for communities like this, the rural portions of the town. There are what, six of them, and 2 of them aren't even on the map. So we're proposing to consolidate that down to 2: an AG agricultural district, which would be for farms. Houses on large lots. As you can see, we haven't quite knocked down the total number of acres, but houses on large lots. and also for your more intensive farming operations. Type of things that if you're a farmer, you don't want somebody in a house next door that doesn't farm complaining about them because you need to do those things to make your living and sell everyone else their food. Second one, what we're calling neighborhood rural. Of course, you're talking about. What we're calling neighborhood rural. So this would be a big lot, you have maybe horses, you have maybe dogs, you have you like the large lot lifestyle, but you're not a farmer. Farming would probably be allowed in this district, but this would be primarily a residential zoning district. We have done even more consolidation on the residential districts. There are a lot. You can see some of them require the exact same thing as far as the number of houses per acre. We are proposing, and I won't go through these in detail unless you would like to talk to me afterwards, we can. We're proposing to consolidate that down to 4. When it comes to your commercial or mixed-use districts, and there's a lot of those right now. We're proposing to consolidate that down to 4. We're also proposing to consolidate industrial districts from 6 to 2, but we're also you do also have floodplain districts and a zoning district just for this facility. We're not proposing to change those. This is a very, very early draft, so we're really kicking around today. We wanted to kind of get it out there. This is what we've heard, what we've seen. Other things that we learned last night, some pictures of our event last night, as you can see, relatively similar, although the view wasn't quite as spectacular. No offense to the fire department down the Fayette. But something similar. In the rural parts of the community, we want to preserve rural character. We heard that loud and clear. We know that that has not always been the case in this region of Indiana, right? As roads come out of Indianapolis, it has not always been checked. And so we want to find ways to preserve that rural character. If we're going to have development, we want to maintain green and open spaces, the concept Mike was talking about. If things are going to be built, we want to ensure diverse architecture and quality architecture and diversity of what gets built, not the same house over and over and over again on what was pristine rural landscape. We want to protect residents when commercial or industrial uses come in. We want to make sure that obviously those are important for the economy of the community, but you don't want to necessarily have one show up in your backyard with no protections from you, no landscaping, no fencing, etc. We have to have that sort of protection for residents. It doesn't mean we're going to stop all that from happening. We're going to make sure there's protections. We can definitely put that in zone. We need a wide variety of housing options, right? Not everyone needs 4 bedrooms, for instance. We want to protect local businesses. This is something we heard this afternoon in some focus groups that when we draw the zoning map, this is your current zoning map, but when you draw the zoning map, there was a comment that, hey, if you put commercial zoning between either downtown Zionsville or some other areas where there's local businesses and the highway, everyone's going to stop with that other commercial zoning that you put. Commercial businesses got no one's going to come downtown. Interesting point. I think we're going to make sure to try to protect businesses. We also want to be thoughtful and intentional in how land is zoned. We said before, the current zoning ordinance is an amalgamation of previous zoning ordinances, and then people coming in and asking for rezonings. And that's how you get the map we have here, which is pretty complicated. So we need to be thoughtful and intentional. What is happening next? We really want to give that a lot of thought. And we want to make the code simpler, of course. Some of our doodles from today. And then we actually, back in headquarters from McKenna, we actually had someone put it in a formal map. This is taking that map and applying the zoning districts that I just talked about. 16. We went from 40 to 16. And obviously this is going to take a lot of refinement, but I think that the overall picture makes sense. The dark green is your agricultural and rural areas. The yellow is more residential areas. The blues and purples are your more heavily developed commercial and industrial and mixed-use areas. And I think that you can see that there is actually a coherency in the current zoning, and we're hoping to reflect that. So with that, I think we're going to take a short Q&A and then get into more flexible discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. First, I'm going to ask everyone just to stand up for 1 second, because you've been sitting for a little bit of time here, and I want everybody to be able to, pay attention to your peers and your neighbors as we do a little bit of questions to help you to stand. So when you're ready, just sit back down when you feel rested, when you feel like you move. I think that what we'd like to do is preserve. We're scheduled to go here till 9. It's 8:07. I think I'd like to preserve at least. Should we say let's go to 8:25? Yeah, and if we have enough questions, let's go about 20 minutes on Q&A. And then just so everybody knows, the rest of the evening, we're going to spend talking with each other. So you can ask your question to us individually. We'll encourage you to write it down. We're going to document everybody's concerns for why you came tonight. But you might have a question that's beneficial to your friends and neighbors too. So we want to take some of those. And I think what I'm going to do is test. If you can just say your name and your question, I'll repeat your question in case anyone doesn't know, because we do have a wire here on the mic, so it's hard for me to pass it off. But would anybody, a brave person, like to get us going with a question or reaction? Let's go here.
Okay, you want to preserve Zionsville, which you've already done, you want to enlarge it. What's happening with Ross? Texas have a water hole, a grain elevator, a post office, and you want to preserve it, and they're just letting it go to hell.
So if I understand correctly, you're saying that Ralston is an area that maybe was that something that we would describe as being a hamlet?
Right.
Adam, do you want to point to it? So
Right there,
this is
correct?
421, just north of 32. Yeah.
this is part of the hamlet concept too, right? Is that there are historic places that absolutely that fit into this idea. So what we would be doing in this hamlet concept is we'd be saying these areas are the places that new commercial or services need to go in the rural areas. And any development would also go in those areas to preserve the rural character. We can talk more about the mechanisms that might work for that, but I know a question came up earlier about, well, how do you do that? Then someone comes along and they want to develop. Well, how do you keep that in place? Generally, it's through a conservation easement. So when you allow this type of development, it's a trading of that 1 unit per acre here, we're going to develop it here, and then we're going to put a conservation easement on that so it can only be used for farming or open space. And it's a very common tool in development, and we think that it will work here. Follow.
On Zionsville and Lebanon, especially remodel Lebanon, as far as parking, if you have a large SUV or a large truck, there's no way you can park on the square to go pay your property tax. That's ridiculous.
So
Zionsville and Lebanon's that way now.
I'm gonna note that one. I'm gonna note that one, and we'll work on that one. Do you have another?
Yes, I do.
All right.
You have codes, and they are solid concrete. What about some big company that just comes in and buys a bunch of land and rezones?
Well, in one of the examples, I said when you do the initial rezoning for a hamlet, you can do deed restrictions, which we run with the land. However, with zoning, you can't rezone, right? So that's part of the nature of things. So I'd say the value of consensus is that your representatives understand that we have some consensus, and hopefully people don't get rezoned. But rezoning happens.
So we just call
Well, we trust our officials to make good decisions. And I know that involves advocating. It involves advocating, and it involves a little bit of dedication. And our 16 zones will be really good. Yeah, I say, yeah, with 16 zones, it will limit a little bit. But no, I understand, of course. I think what I said when I started the presentation, if you like your town, the worst thing you can do is nothing, right? So by doing this, we're doing something. We're doing something to direct future growth the way we want it to happen. I'd say if we don't do this, the chances of having a scenario that you don't want would be much more likely. Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And that's when it's on the book, when I talked earlier and I said it becomes a standard, what it means really is that this is a legal enforceable regulation. In order not to develop according to that regulation, they have to rezone or change it, and then they have to go through this whole process again. So it really does protect the design intent. And on the comprehensive plan, it's supposed to be linked to the zoning.
Sorry, Paul. So there's another document that's important here, which is the comprehensive plan, which is supposed to be your community's articulation of its future. Your current comprehensive plan is over on the table. Adam's grabbing it in case anyone wants to look at it after Q&A. It's over there. The comprehensive plan is one of the major criteria your town council is supposed to take into account when someone asks for a rezoning. The reason we're being a little bit hesitant here is that ultimately it is your town council's decision whether something gets rezoned or not. Right? They have the final say. And the comprehensive plan is a guide. That said, when the comprehensive plan says agricultural, rural, and someone comes in and says, I want to build a giant factory, your town council should say, no. Comprehensive plan says agricultural and rural. And by that, I don't mean generally, I mean this particular piece of land says that. So you have tools at your disposal, and they are important to keep updated and current and reflect what you want. So that you all can go to that town council meeting and come up and say, I know what the comprehensive plan says. And I'm going to remember next election if you ignore that comprehensive plan.
Thank you, Chris. I'm gonna go over here because I think you wanted to ask a question during the presentation. So the question is, if there's something on the map that is shown as agricultural, does the person who owns the land get compensation for it being agricultural land? And one of the things that I would say in principle, when we're showing the consolidation of districts versus the current zoning map, and then when we consolidate it, is that we're really carrying through the development rights. What we're doing is we're assigning those development rights in new ways. So when Mike showed the example of a build out that was a more hamlet style, the person who owns all of that land would be able to essentially capture the value for the 40 units he was showing on the smaller part of the parcel. So it's a way of capturing the development value while you're also preserving the land. And it's in concept, what it allows is for people to realize the value of their agricultural process in a way that also allows them to develop their property in a way that's respectful of their community, right? So what we want to do is avoid the suburbanization of agricultural land, but create an ability for more housing and preserving the agricultural landscape. That's the concept. Yes, sir. Yes. What you do is you transfer. So what? Yeah. So this example, it's one property owner, right? So the property owner, if they were to develop, at the time you choose to develop that property, at the time you make that deal, let's say, you make a deal for developing 41 acre units on your property. What this would permit you to do is to capture that development potential, that value, at the time you make the deal. But then, yes, the rest of this would be frozen in value. It would no longer be developable, but it would be valued as agricultural. So you retain your cultivation rights for that property. Even if you lease that to a farmer, you'd be able to lease it for that use. So basically what it allows you to do is capture the residential value, but actually keep the agricultural value, which is interesting. And, you know, there are... As Mike... Sure. I certainly understand the purpose of maintaining the ability to farm, and that there are externalities with farming that people who live in cities don't really want or aren't used to. I think this idea here also helps to preserve that, because I think that you get that either way. You definitely get it. I think you get it more with the 100 units all around too, because this actually allows that residential development to be concentrated. And as Mike said too, it's concentrated in an area where you've got light signals, roads, where you want your neighborhood store. So there are externalities with farming. Most people that want to live in farms understand that. Some people don't. But I think this helps. It helps that issue, which will be there regardless of how it lands today. Does that make sense? All right, thank you. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to let Chris answer that.
So this example is someone maximizing the amount of houses they could build on their lot. So I think that's kind of a key assumption in those 3 slides. This is someone in all cases maximizing the number of houses they could build. But in your scenario, if there's more value financially or just culturally, they just prefer, hey, what I really want is 5 acres. And I own 20, so I'm willing to sell off about 3 more 5 acre parcels. I'll have 4 acres, all 3 acres. We'll have hobby parcels, we'll have horses. Okay. We're not going to be commercial farmers, but we'll have big lots. That would be perfectly acceptable under what we're talking about. It's perfectly acceptable under current zoning. But the concern we have with current zoning is the current zoning puts very few restrictions on the opportunity to do this. So what we're trying to do is keep what you're talking about as a possibility while restricting, at least in the agricultural rural areas, the ability to do that. Sure, and that's why we talked about 2, and this is actually the other question too. Well, we're talking about 2 agricultural or 2 rural districts, right? One that is for the more intensive farming, and would allow some development of houses, but maybe fewer, and one that is for more like you're talking about, the hobby farming and horses. Understanding that those are compatible, but they're not the same thing.
I'm going to get to someone else first, and then I'll come back. Over here. No's. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yes. So the question was, is the Hamlet concept basically an equivalent to the idea of a node? You're creating a new node that could be the center of new development. And I'm saying yes. I think that is kind of what we're talking about. Although smaller, right? A hamlet is a very small place, but significant. Mike also mentioned new centers or new town centers. Those might be larger, but not as many. I think we think maybe 3, but also controlled nodes where we would direct all of the growth of that region into that node of activity. And the village is the big node. That would be the biggest node in the entire town, at least if we envision it. So your central place would remain the Zionsville village. But I've got one more, and I am going to come back to you, but I'm seeing some people behind you. Yes. Yes, so the question was, does zoning control both guidelines for light and noise? And Yes, so in different districts, yes, we can regulate light and noise. I would draw a distinction, though. You can also have general regulations. I think the town does have some, like a noise control ordinance or order. Some of those types of things are also regulated through general town rules. But zoning does control, it does have regulations for light, noise, and particularly one of the things that we know is also an issue is industrial growth, which we will be thinking about industrial growth and making sure that new industrial, which can be valuable, it generates taxes, it generates jobs. We like industry. We just want it not to also have externalities on residences. So we heard a little bit about that last night. And I'm going to go here just briefly because Pam's related. Yes.
All right. The dump over there in Northfield, they put a brand new fire department years back. My property on 200 North. Zoning says we need to call a fire department. I'm supposed to call a sheriff. And my husband got me on my call to a fire department. That's $55. The new one was there within like 4 minutes. And didn't get ready to dress and got my vehicle. Here comes Sheridan ambulance. What can we do about that kind of stuff if they're so far?
Well, it's not really a zoning issue. So what you're
That's
talking,
what they're telling us, is we got charged for using that fire department.
let's do this. Let's you and I follow up so I can understand the issue more, and let's talk about that. Because if I can help with that, I'd like to do so. Back here.
I have a question about your sort of circles of how this project comes to fruition.
Yes.
And you were kind of at circle 3 or 2.
Sure.
And I was wondering if you have an estimation of how long it gets to the final circle. And also one that really stuck out to me was town accepts or town adopts. If you could be more specific about what that means. I'm assuming it's not us that you're talking to now because we're sort of providing our input now. Would that be the town council? Would that be other commissions? How exactly does this come to fruition?
It would be the town council adopting. It would not be the whole town. And the timeline is, I'd say probably 9 months to a year. I think we're a little bit behind where we intended to be when we started our analysis. We hope to do this event in the spring and now it's the fall. So I think we're probably 9 months out before we actually are into that process. The other thing that I should mention too is there's a website called ZionsvilleTownCode.com, and in addition to providing us feedback here tonight, there's a comment box there, but we also added an email sign up there. If you sign in tonight, we'll have your email, but it is a long process, so our intent is to follow up and let people know how it goes as we develop. Yes.
Is there a community that is modeling this town center and hamlet style well that we would know about, that we could using it locally and see how that develops?
Well, Mike presented some work that we did in Van Buren, Michigan, that we're utilizing this hamlet concept on. This is a growth management concept, which is actually dates back probably 30 or 40 years. It's a form of transfer development rights, but it is done. What we're proposing is that it's done through zoning requirements. And what's that? Oh, Holly Township is another township that we've worked on this with. If you're interested in some samples, let me research that one too. But the idea of using hamlets or growth control, it's actually pretty common, and it's a fairly old concept. We have one here.
So that's the reason that, and your developers are now buying up large parcels of land, so how is that going to control the clean your plan, they don't have all this stuff. Pre-purchases by people that are.
Well,
Please repeat the question.
yes, so I'm going to repeat it, and if I miss anything, help me out again. So I think the question is that there are areas in the town that have already been zoned, say, R3 from an AG. And how do we make sure that those areas are preserved if they're already zoned R3? And I would say, for the purpose of this, I think we are probably going to carry through an R3 district to a comparable new district. It might be what we're going to call rural residential.
Assuming the R3 would be relatively high, because not
Yeah.
multifamily, but
Correct.
higher density.
Yeah, there's a
Oh.
lot. And these are not going to be homes that live in a rural setting whatsoever.
And they're getting rough.
Oh, sure.
But it's already been zoned that way. You don't have any control over it. But opposed to now you have to do aesthetically pleasing and look like a rural setting. You have to front of ones like this that are already.
Well, in the R3 districts, which we do have the ability to do design standards and requirements as part of the R3 district, and even to modify those standards is possible. But I think to be fair, the current R3 we would probably carry through that development density to the new code, right? So our plan and what Chris presented in the first map is kind of saying you've got 40 districts right now. We're going to consolidate those districts to make sure they make sense. And basically, let's call apples apples, and let's call oranges oranges. Let's not call apples bananas, right? So we're going to take the apples, and we're going to say these are similar, and we're probably going to call those R3. So your R3 is probably going to stay R3. Absolutely, and that's where we talk about the design standards. Does that make sense? And I think that's something to think about as we talk about rezoning or as we talk about updating this code. And I kind of said this at the beginning too, is that we want to understand what the development rights that are permitted are, and we want to reorganize those in a way that makes sense and matches the community's perceptions and desires for new growth. So we're not going to say, oh, no, you can't build there now. No, of course you can. Of course you can. We're going to maintain those rights. We want to make it easier for people to develop in a manner that their neighbors, friends, business owners would like. We want the town to develop in a way that people like, right? Does that make sense? Which is why, as Chris mentioned, it's also important to plan, right? Because we're not going to express all of those preferences through this process. What we're really doing is trying to understand the regulations, understand the preferences, and then making sure the regulations and the preferences match. Do we have any other? Oh, wait, hold on. Let me do a time check. Oh, I said 8:25 and it's 8:30. So I would like to leave some time for us to talk informally. But let me take not more than two. Let me take two more because I already saw a hand go up over here.
It sounds like you're basing this off of like more kind of small rural towns that used to exist a long time ago, and like those towns have kind of like failed and turned into skeletons of themselves. So what about like this model will keep the like retail or the market, like the market, different things, like what will stop that from happening? Yeah.
Mike made this point last night, and I'm going to try it. It's rooftops. I mean, that's what makes towns work, right? So I think the Hamlet model is unique and interesting because what we're saying is if you want to build residential, you must build it in a Hamlet form. So you must build those services that come with that residential adjacent to that residential. And I would like it to be around the historic hamlets. It might not be how it happens, but it could be. And I would like it to happen that way, but who knows? Adam's got it.
just really quickly, because we're talking about market perspective, another analogy to make, think about a planet, think about Venus or Jupiter or Saturn, right? It has moons, you know, Earth has moons, it doesn't move, but other planets have multiple moons, right? They're in that planet's orbit, right? And it's the kind of the same situation from an economic standpoint. There are larger, think of them as planets, Zionsville, and places outside of your jurisdiction, Whitestown, and what's going on in Westfield and Carmel. Those are, you know, kind of like the planets, and those rooftops collectively within a regional framework, right, support this network of smaller communities around them. So that's why Mike likes to show his map of Stuttgart, Germany. Not because we want to all of a sudden become like Germany, but because that's the principle, you know, at work.
But what they've done is Mike uses the Germany example because it is existing, and they have developed it over a period of time, all these great hamlets and smaller towns in that region, while preserving the landscape. And that's why he gives that example, because it can happen. It can happen. All right, I'm going to take one more. Who wants to give us the last question? Or if nobody does, let's break it up. I'm going to go to your friend over here. One more. So, well, so let's, yeah. So we do want to hear from you tonight. So we're proposing ideas. But if you think the idea is not a good idea, we're here to hear. And believe me, the last thing we would ever want to do is make it solve it. That's not why we're here at all. So please talk to us. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And so that question came up and Chris responded to. If it's a smaller than 40 acres, but if you want to sell out 5 for more of a hobby farm or something like that, that will also be permitted. I think what we understand, what we've heard, is that the agricultural character, Union Township and Perry, when we were in Perry last night, is important and it matters, and it's something that wants to be preserved. The reason why we're talking about this hamlet idea is because it's a way for people like you to capture that value without having your community and what you care about lost in the process. Well, right, and that's what we're saying. I think that this is a way of making sure what's happened in Whitestown doesn't happen here, right? This is one way for you to make sure that the area is protected. But also, you know, Chris and I particularly, we work in a lot of rural towns. We understand that there is value associated with your property that you need to protect, right? So we're here tonight to talk about that. If anyone else that came tonight to kind of talk about those issues, let's continue that conversation. Maybe you'll provide a map. Let's look at your property. Show us where you. We talked to some people last night in Perry that were 3 generations were in the room talking with us. That's right. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. And we're going to break. I'm going to remind you, though, we got the kitchen table back there. That's where we're going to talk over the map. Show us where you live. Show us where you came from. You got a big idea, put it up here. We got some maps for you to draw on, and we're really interested to talk to everybody. So thank you for sitting. Appreciate it.